Welcome back to another episode of the Rain Race Podcast, the Fumble Race Podcast. As it's 9 minutes late, we took some technical difficulties getting this show off the ground. Evidently, that's what happens when you skip a podcast for 3 weeks and you forget how you configured the streaming settings yourself. Anyways, enough of that. Got off in the Esses with me again tonight. How are you doing tonight, Stu?
Doing pretty good. It wouldn't be a little return if there weren't for some technical difficulties. So
it's sad. We've gotten worse because I think we were late a couple of weeks ago or for a previous episode not too long ago for a similar reason. So we'll figure it out. Trust me. I'll get it down in the off season. We are in the off season, by the way. How does that make you feel?
Oh man, it feels they're still racing on. At least they're still racing on. But it doesn't feel, where did the year go? It feels like it was just yesterday that we were at the Rolex and in Sebring for Super Sebring, and man, it's all gone now.
Yep. Yeah, so it's all, for a couple months at least. You know, the nice thing about the sports car racing off season is that it's pretty short actually. I guess if you want to just look at IMSA and the WEC with the Rolex kicking off again, or I guess the Roar before that in the middle/end of January, and then a couple months off for Sebring, and then Qatar for the new season starter for the FIA World Endurance Championship next year. But that's a story for another day. We have today to discuss the season finale for the FIA World Endurance Championship of the 2023 season. I may have put a mistake in my tweet about that. At Bahrain this past weekend. A lot to discuss from that weekend. Yeah. Trust me, the future's brighter, I'll tell you that. We got, I'll also mention as well, since obviously this is our maybe 6th or 7th episode since reviving the podcast. Obviously, with it being live, you can ask some of your questions in the chat. We'll try to get to those throughout the episode where they seem appropriate, and then we'll just try to get as many as we can at the end of the episode. We actually had some questions come in from yesterday and today as well, both on Twitter and on Stu. You put out a YouTube community post getting some questions as well, so we'll get to those at the end of the episode. Looking down the names here, we got Taurus. How you doing, Taurus? Got some people making fun of me for the technical difficulties. Got an infringement. We've been disqualified, tossed out. That's unfortunate.
Penalty before we even hit turn 1.
Yeah. Plenty to talk about during the off-season, of course, and we will be here hopefully every 2 weeks. I say every 2 weeks, and then last week was Halloween in the United States land and Canada land as well. So the house was a little bit noisy. Didn't want to do a podcast in the middle of that. Might have gotten a bit hectic. Yeah. So, and the Golf 12 Hours in the Asian Le Mans Series at Sepang in December as well. There you go. Sports car racing off-season is never really a real thing. I want to start things off today. I want to talk about the season finale at Bahrain. Like I said, there were a lot of storylines going into the race. I think the biggest thing is that qualifying actually mattered quite a bit for the hypercar category. You talk about the World Endurance Championship, qualifying doesn't really ever matter that much. I guess for Le Mans, you can say it's bragging rights to be on pole, but for the most part, it's really just an indication of who has the best one-lap pace. But for this year, we had a bit of a championship rivalry to settle in qualifying. Not really to settle, but to get an additional point for. Obviously, the pole sitter in the FIA World Endurance Championship in all 3 classes, all 2 next year, gets an extra bonus point for being on the pole position. The way it was set up this year, following the previous race at Bahrain, is that if the number 7 car got pole in qualifying, they would get an additional bonus point, and the 8 car would need to finish 3rd to win the championship if the number 7 car won. I believe I got that right. Likewise, if the number 8 car got pole, which they ended up doing, the number 7 car would need the 8 car to finish 4th or lower in the race if the number 7 won for the number 7 car to win the championship. Like I said, pole position for the 8 car, Brendan Hartley, another pole position for the year. Looked like the 7 car might have had a chance, but Kamui Kobayashi, I think, had a bit of a lockup on his fast lap. Don't know the turn numbers up Bahrain at all, but I believe it was his fast lap when we saw that lockup from him. Rare mistake in qualifying, but ultimately the 8 car took a pretty healthy pole position for that one. Moving on to the start of the race, And by the way, I don't want to go over every single thing that happened in this race. Quite frankly, I woke up on Saturday morning. It was a 7 a.m. start. on the east coast of the United States, and I woke up at my former college visiting some friends. So I was sort of off and on watching the race in the earlier hours. But what I can tell you is right at the start, second race in a row, we saw a pretty hefty lockup from the number 2 Cadillac, the sole Cadillac in the full season WEC. Even worse than what we saw at Fuji, which resulted in the Toyota getting pushed off the track. This one, we actually saw the number 2 car get into the back of the number 7 Toyota, sent the number 7 car all the way back behind all the GTE cars before they could rejoin safely, and they ended up getting a 1-minute stop and hold penalty for that. Similar things to what we saw at Monza with the number 8 Toyota getting into, I believe it was the 51 Ferrari. I want to say it was the 51. Flip a coin. It might have been the 50. I can't remember. So I think that this is a bit of a continuation to what we've seen this season. I know in particular the LMDH cars at Daytona, this was a big talking point with getting used to the brake-by-wire system for the first time. It's a lot less of a, I guess, consistent feel on the brake pedal, especially in the World Endurance Championship and in IMSA with those cold tires at the start.
Yeah, it was tough to watch that unfold. It's kind of like you're watching a train wreck in slow motion. Once you see somebody start to lock up into a corner like turn 1, it's it's probably not going to end too well. Even though thankfully there was a lot of space for cars to be able to maneuver around, but it would have been not a fun position for I believe it was Rang or Van de Zandt that started the race.
Nope, he's not in the car. It was Earl Bamber.
Oh no, I'm mixing up my championships.
Hey.
It is the off season.
They did. Hey, I'll give you one thing. Ranger did race in 2 WEC races if you include Le Mans. So
that is true. Look, I don't think we've touched on what the result of it was. I'm sure we'll talk about that in a second. But a tough incident to watch, of course, for the number 7. They're battling for. They really needed to have everything go their way to be able to stay in shot of the championship, and it really did not start off the way that they would have wanted.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, that's
turn 1.
Really, with starting in second place, they needed to put as much pressure on the 8 car as possible. Maybe hope for some mechanical gremlin with that sister car. Maybe force the driver into a rare mistake in the 8 car. Realistically, I think that what we saw in turn 1 sort of sealed the fate for that car, and it really set the pace for them for the entire race, unfortunately. Like I said, they dropped back behind the entire GTE field, behind all the LMP2 cars. They had to work their way up, and I will say it was an impressive opening stint, and they were actually able to get back to, I guess they were battling with the Ferrari earlier on in the race for second place, but able to get on the tail of second place after the first hour of the race, which was pretty impressive, really indicative of their pace. A lot of people brought that up as a negative and saying that that was an indication that the balance of performance was a bit off. I'll talk about that a little bit later, I think. But from that point on, you're sitting a healthy gap behind the 8 car. I don't remember exactly how much it was. I want to say it was around the realm of 40 seconds. And it really just stayed like that for the rest of the race pretty much.
Yep.
We did see some inter-team battling, maybe a little bit more than that going on in the race between Ferrari, the 50 and the 51 car. We had an interesting radio bite from Justin Taylor saying that the sister car, the 50 car, had no manners. Don't remember the driver in the car at that time, but a bit of some cheeky radio drama going on there between the 2 Ferraris. If you're not going to have a battle for the lead, you might as well have some inter-team drama to hold us over.
Of course, it would be Ferrari too.
Oh yeah, of course. I mean, at the end of the day, with where they were sitting in the race, they weren't really fighting. Certainly weren't fighting for the championship. They could have finished second in the championship if something happened to the number 7 car with a DNF, but at that point, you might as well go for some inter-team pride and try to settle some scores between both of those cars. I'm hoping, not really hoping, I'm expecting we won't see it continue into next year as they try to mount a proper championship winning effort. But it was nice to see that for the final race of this season. And not just that, but we also saw quite a substantial battle between one of the Ferraris. I'm mixing them up, but I think it was the 50 car and the Jota 963 as well, the 38 car. I want to go on the record and say I think that was one of the most impressive intermanufacturer battles that we'd seen this season in the WEC, with the exception of maybe Le Mans had some great battles between manufacturers as well. But the 38 and the Ferrari just didn't seem to be able to get away from each other for the majority of the race. And ultimately, there was something that separated the Jota with them. And I'll get to that in a second. Like I said, though, strong showing from the Jota in the race. I noted out in particular Antonio Felix da Costa as an extremely impressive driver at Bahrain. Was in third place, closing in on the second place, number 7 Toyota. Didn't really look like they'd have the pace to close in the gap to steal second, but closing in nonetheless. I think they had the fastest lap at some point during the race. Ultimately, where things went south for that car is Antonio Felix da Costa ran wide at turn 1, like 10 minutes after I was praising him on Twitter, being driver of the day, of course, and ended up getting... Yeah, I did it. He impeded the D-Station Aston Martin, which I believe was in second place at the time, and got a stop-and-go penalty for that incident. So ran off track turn 1. If you know anything about Bahrain, the rejoin at turn 2 is kind of weird. It's a hard right-hander, almost like a hairpin at turn 1, and then a little bit of a flick to the left. There's not really a great place to rejoin there. Unfortunately, he just came out on track in front of the Aston and ended up getting, again, a stop-and-go penalty for that one, which I know he was very vocal about in some of the post-race interviews. And I wanted to get some of your opinions on this, and maybe some opinions from the chat as well, but you have to ask the question if a penalty like that is a little bit too harsh, especially when it's really a chance thing. You can't tell where that GTE car is going to be behind you when you rejoin the track. I think he tried to do it in as safe a manner as possible, but just with the way the corner is set up, you come back on track right onto the apex of turn 2. So it's a bit of a crapshoot in terms of trying to rejoin safely there. Some of your thoughts on that, though. I'm kind of curious.
Yeah, I'll tell you one thing. I think that call, I think that was a fair call to make based on some of the other calls that we saw made earlier in the race. We saw the penalty that I think I had more of an issue with was actually the penalty that the Cadillac got for the turn 1 incident. Got a stop and hold for a minute. Now, I would definitely expect a penalty to be coming in that instance, but it was an unfortunate situation. You get a little bit too hard on the brakes with cold tires, you're going to lock up, and at that point, you are along for the ride. It was unfortunate that it happened. Maybe, again, I'm not exactly sure what penalties race control has available to them. But I thought the hold for a minute was a little bit rough, maybe a little bit extreme. But then if you contrast that to this penalty where you said it was just a stop and go, that seems about fair. Like, I think that this should be treated less severe than the penalty into turn 1 for the Cadillac. And at that point, if you had only given the Cadillac a stop and go or a drive through, then, what penalty do you dish out for an incident like this? It was definitely an unsafe rejoin, I think. Unfortunate. It's difficult to see. It's difficult to rejoin going into turn 2, but at that point, I think you have to be counting on the team to help you understand what cars might potentially be coming and what the gaps just might be. And it was a difficult scenario for them, obviously, but I didn't hate the penalty, but I think it was a tough situation for everybody to be in, because I think, where do you draw the line? If you don't penalize an unsafe rejoin, you're kind of creating a gray area or more of a gray area than an unsafe rejoin already is. How much do you have to impede a car on a rejoin for it to be unsafe? Or, I don't know. What did you think?
I thought, given the circumstances of the corner, I think it was a little bit harsh. I mean, we've seen the championship dish out time penalties to be served at the next pit stop. There's certainly enough time left in the race for them to issue a penalty like that. I think that would have been better suited. You have to remember the nature of the race, of course. You're talking about, in this case, this was an 8-hour endurance race with 0 safety cars. If you compare it to a penalty in, say, an F1 race where it seems like a 5-second time penalty is the most common thing dished out, a 5-second time penalty in F1 is going to go a lot farther than a 5-second penalty in the World Endurance Championship, of course, being an 8-hour race. I do think it was a bit harsh, though. And noting what you were saying with the Cadillac, the biggest thing you can wish for when it comes to penalties, regardless of how lenient or how harsh they are, is consistency.
Yep.
What we saw, now this is where I start to wonder how the stewards hand out penalties. Because what we saw at Monza with the 8 Toyota and Sebastian Buemi hitting the Ferrari at the start and turning them around, is we saw a 10-second stop and hold penalty in the pits. So I start to wonder, how do you judge that? Is it based on how much time the car you hit lost? Is it due to the severity of the lockup? We saw the Cadillac was locked up for a lot longer than the Toyota was. But I think that leaves more of a gray area than anything else. And I think, I haven't read the WEC rulebook. Maybe they do have it clearly defined how they're going to dish out those penalties. But I really would hope to see some consistency with things like that in the future, though. I think that's where you're going to start to run into some drama if you have inconsistencies in the penalties that you're assigning.
Yeah. You just want consistency. Like you said, nailed it with that point is, gray area or not, like you want consistency. And it would be great if we could get an understanding from the stewards as to what their decision making was when it comes to deciding the severity of these penalties. Like, what factors are they bringing into play? I know there's some major sports leagues that will indicate on a replay review, why a certain decision was made, or there might be a statement that's released after the fact. Could we have something like that in sports car racing to help us understand some of these penalties that, as you just pointed out, may have some inconsistencies in them, but with a little bit more context would help us, the fans, to understand them a lot better.
Yep. Just looking around the chat, what some people had said on that one. I saw something on here. Now I can't find it.
I'd rather WEC be penalizing dodgy, impatient rejoins than being lax about these sorts of rules.
Yeah, I think that sort of echoes exactly what you said, where you think it was a worthy penalty. It's just the severity of the penalty that really comes into question. Don't want any more gray areas in sports car racing. Yeah, I agree with that as well. As long as it's clearly defined, and if the penalty is either completely consistent or at least you have documented reasoning on how you're going to assign the severity of a penalty, I think that's really the most you can ask for. And also a note on that one from the same person, Shame DeCoste has been reassigned to Formula E. He'll be sorely missed by us Jota fans. And I'll say, on topic of me calling him the driver of the day, and I'll still put my hand up and say he was one of the drivers of the day, even with that penalty, is I think that was a bit of a look what you're missing out on performance from him. Porsche reassigning him, of course, to the factory Formula E effort for next year, wants him to focus on that. I think that this was really a great fairy tale performance for him to show he still has the skills, what it takes to drive in the top class of sports car racing and really put on a fantastic show for all of us. In the LMP2 class, talking about some inter-team battles, we had a fight for the win between the two WRT cars in the LMP2 class. And the one thing I noted about this is the 31 car actually had an issue changing their left front tire in the final pit stop, which handed the lead to the sister 41 car. It sounded as if from radio communications that they were going to swap those positions back at the finish and give the 31 car the win, but that never happened, to my knowledge at least. And the 41 car ended up winning the race in the LMP2 class. So not really sure if I missed something on that one. Maybe I misinterpreted the radio call at the or the initial radio message. At least from what I had heard and from what the commentators were saying as well, it sounded like that position was going to be swapped. But 1-2 for the WRT team, and just not quite in the order that I was expecting based on those communications. And I think the highlight story from this race, for multiple reasons, was the final GTE race of all time. Class spanning back good 20 plus years, actually well over 20 years actually. Have a video coming out on that one. I don't want to make any promises because I'm a bit behind where I want to be in the production of it, but I'd say at some point in the next week or so, I'm going to be getting out a video on the GTE formula as a whole. But for this race, for the finale, the final race of GTE AM and GTE as an entirety, it was a battle for the victory between the fabled Iron Dames Porsche and the D Station Aston Martin that I had mentioned from the Jota penalty. At the end of the race, it came down to two drivers, Michel Gatting and Casper Stevenson. The gap was closing over the final stint. I think I saw it go from 10 seconds down to 8 seconds, 5 seconds, below 5 seconds. I want to say it was around like 2 seconds at one point, maybe less than that. But the gap stabilized out, and I think Michel Gatting got a better run in traffic towards the end of the race, along with just putting in some hard, consistent lap times at the finish, and started to bring that gap back up in the final laps. And ultimately, in the final GTE race of all time, it was the all-female crewed, or all-female driver, Iron Dames team with their Porsche 911 RSR that took that historic victory. Really big story. Not just in the FIA World Endurance Championship, but also motorsports as a whole, I think, was picking up on this one. The first all-female win, I think I already mentioned that, for a lineup in the FIA World Endurance Championship. Stu, any thoughts on that one from you?
That was a great battle right down to the end, and a very
Absolutely.
well-deserved victory. You saw the D Station Aston Martin. They were closing in ever so slightly in the final half hour or so, and then they got into some traffic, and man, the Iron Dames managed the traffic brilliantly. Maybe caught a few breaks, which they haven't caught in previous races, and they were able to grow that gap a little to a bit more of a comfortable one, and bring it home. It was great to watch them, finally get that trip to the top step of the podium in the final GTE race. That was really cool to see, and really happy for them. I think it's gonna put some more pep in their step heading into the off season.
Yeah, certainly. I think all you were looking for at the end of that race, no matter who you were a fan of, was a good battle down to the wire, because GTE has given us some classic moments over the years, and I think we got what we had wanted. We weren't really sure who the winner was going to be going into that final stint, and we had a great battle, and great to see that historic victory, and like you said, great storylines leading into the off season, going into next year. Back in the hypercar category, it was unsurprisingly, based on what we said earlier, the number 8 Toyota that won the race overall after leading all day. I can't remember if they had ever lost the lead at all in that race. If they did, it was certainly only because of pit cycles. Nobody even really came close to them, despite the fact that they actually had a clutch issue that was reported after the race. That clutch issue seemed to be affecting them for the majority of the race, slowing them down as they were leaving the pit stalls. Actually, you talk about issues with teams, with hypercar teams having issues during the race. There were actually a lot of them. The number 7 Toyota, the sister car, had a torque sensor issue that was reported. Both factory Porsches had sensor issues, amongst some other reported issues. The 51 Ferrari had an issue with the rear dampers towards the end of the race. The Proton 963, the 99 car, had an issue with a footrest. Not really sure exactly what, but apparently it impacted their braking performance. And the Van Wall, surprising or not, had some engine issues that resulted in a loss of power throughout the race. We're one season done now, 7 races complete with most of these cars. Of course, the exceptions to that would be the Peugeot and the Toyota. And we're still experiencing some teething issues, especially for this slightly longer 8-hour endurance race than what we'd seen for the majority of the season in those 6-hour enduros. Something to note for the off-season now, I know Porsche had mentioned they're trying to bring some reliability improvements. We're seeing a revamp to the 9X8 over the off-season. Be interested to see what some of the other manufacturers bring to the table as well to try to sort out those reliability issues. Because the next major race, of course, between IMSA and the WEC is that 24-hour race at Daytona in January. And if there's any race where you don't want reliability issues, that's probably a bit up there. I already mentioned this one, but I'll say it again. WRT had a 1-2 in the LMP2 class, the 41 car over the 31 car. WRT, of course, will be graduating into the hypercar category next year with two BMWs in the WEC. And then, of course, we had already mentioned the Iron Dames victory in GTEM. For the championship, again, I've sort of already hinted about this enough, but it was a Toyota 1-2 in the teams championship again, with the number 8 car taking their second consecutive championship and fourth since 2014. The LMP2 championship was all but wrapped up before the race began, but it was the 41 WRT again that took the championship over the 34 Le Mans winning Inter Europol team. And finally, GTEM, that championship's been wrapped up for months now by Corvette, but Iron Dames was able to solidify a P2 in front of the 54 AF Corsa Ferrari with their win at Bahrain. So, I think that about covers it for the Bahrain recap. I'm looking through the messages again to see if there's anything related to Bahrain that I had missed before we move on to the news stories.
What were your thoughts as on a whole on the season?
Okay. Don't want to get myself in trouble.
Open up a can of worms.
Don't want to get myself in trouble. I think. Okay, I'm going to be honest. I think for the hypercar category, it didn't quite live up to the expectations that were set out at the beginning. I could talk about this a lot. The more I talk, the more I'm going to get myself in trouble. So maybe we save it for the off season, but we're already in the off season. It's already too late. I think the expectation going into the season, based on what people are saying, is, if you think Toyota is going to dominate every single race, think again. Look at the manufacturers that we have. We have Porsche, we have Ferrari. These are no strangers to sports car racing.
Yep. And
I think that with the exception of Le Mans, of course, and you can even make a strong argument to that one with some BOP controversy, Toyota really did seem to have a stronghold over the hypercar category. And I think a lot of that is to be expected because obviously this is the third year they're running that car. They've been running the championship every single year since 2012. They're going up against cars that are, for the most part, extremely new and unproven, and teams that, while have a lot of experience in sports car racing, not necessarily a lot of experience in the hypercar category. I think that there was a learning curve for a lot of the other teams to catch up, but I do think that there needs to be some evaluation done in the off season because I think that there's a bit. I'm going to save this for the BOP section that we're going to go over. Okay, I'm going to save it for that because I think it's better suited for that. To give the race a rating on a scale A to F, I would say that it was a solid B race. I think it was one of the better WEC races of the season. If you exclude the fact that the number 8 car had a significant lead, largely down to consequences of what happened in turn 1, I think we had some great battles. We had great battle for the win in GTEM, and LMP2 was holding up the fort as well. I think that it was a pretty good race. For this season, I would say that it was average at best, and I think that's a bit controversial, but I think that there is additional things that can be done to make it even greater. I think you have all the pieces to the puzzle. You just need to put them together in the right way now.
And I think we were tracking as the season came down to the final few races. We were definitely tracking towards, I feel like, some of the improvements being made, whether this comes down to, some small BOP adjustments that were being made, or teams having better ideas of what their cars were going to do in different conditions, in different situations. We saw Porsche come on really strong at Fuji. They looked good, and then they were strong again at Bahrain. So I think I agree with you on the sort of averageness of the season, but even with the overall, there were still some amazing, bright, shining points for in this race. Which I thought there were battles in all three of the classes at various points in the race. Maybe not necessarily for the lead, but there were some great battles going on for different podium spots. Pretty much throughout the entire race. So that was really great to watch. And I think we saw that throughout the whole season, throughout the classes as well. We saw some great battling for hypercar podiums. I mean, GTE just seems to always deliver. And then LMP2, I feel like kind of always flies a bit under the radar, but always gives us a great racing product as well. So I think I agree with what you said, that a bit of an average season, but I think there was a really good foundation that was laid to really build on this going into 2024. Almost said 2023.
Yep. I'm living in the future. You're living in the past.
Yep.
So Andrew said Toyota's always going to dominate even with a huge BOP. I'm guessing BOP ballast that they're carrying. They're the heaviest car in the class. The development of the car is far better easily. Absolutely, 100%. Nobody's going to argue that. I think where I have an issue is actually not necessarily with the performance deficit of the cars. It all comes down to the expectation that was set forward by people at the beginning of the season, during last season, and I think that it fell a bit short of that. In fact, one of my favorite quotes from YouTuber Marquez Brownlee is, "Expectation is the thief of joy." So if you think about it, if you set the bar way up here and you're saying that we're going to have, this is going to be the greatest WEC battles that you've ever seen. This is going to be, think of all these manufacturers that we have. This is where the bar is. If you have an average race, it's going to look even worse because you set the bar so high that it didn't really quite live up to that, and then you're disappointed. I think that's the main takeaway that I have from this season. I think there was a little bit too much hype for the actual product that we had seen most of the races. But like you said, I think we're bound to see improvement next year. I'm hoping we're going to see improvement, and can't really elaborate much more on that. We'll have to see what we get next year. Hypercar has the potential to be pure cinema, but the BOP system needs tinkering. So I agree with that. I think, and I'll talk about this because we have a BOP story to talk about during this episode. But I think, absolutely, I think there's some work that needs to be done. And I'm not saying you got to penalize the Toyota more, first and foremost. I just think that the system overall needs to be tinkered with a bit because I think that we're seeing a little bit too much drama right now. And I'll touch on that later in this episode. I want to move on to the news, though. Stu, you have an interesting piece of news that came out. I believe it came out this morning.
Yes. And I saw some mention of it in the chat already, and that is regarding the ACO forbidding non-LMGT3 brands at Le Mans. So basically what it boils down to is manufacturers in the new LMGT3 class are not going to be able to just enter Le Mans as a one-off race. So you're not going to be able to see, let's say, for instance, Audi doesn't make the full season WEC grid. They're not going to be able to have a car enter Le Mans as a one-off, whether they get in through an Asian Le Mans Series victory or some other means of getting there. They're not going to be able to do that. It's only going to be the 9 manufacturers that the FIA and ACO approved to enter. So I think there's some pretty solid reasoning behind this as well. You don't want to introduce a new variable into the BOP process for that class just for Le Mans. You want to be able to use all the data that you've gathered from the previous races in the season and be able to apply that for your Le Mans BOP. But really, I thought this raised or brought to light again another important question, and that's just a matter of who is going to be the manufacturers that are approved for the LMGT3 grid. It's pretty. I think it was actually mentioned in another piece today that I think it's a 37 car grid in the WEC next year, and there's expected to be 9 LMGT3 manufacturers. It seems like BMW, Corvette, Ferrari, Lamborghini, Lexus, Porsche, and Aston Martin are virtually shoe-ins. Maybe the Aston Martin isn't quite a shoe-in, but due to their previous history in the WEC, it seems like they have a pretty safe.
I'd say they're a shoe-in.
Yeah. But that leaves Audi, Ford, McLaren, and Mercedes for the remaining 2 spots. It seems like Ford and McLaren have a pretty clear upper hand, given that they're partnering with Proton, who is running in the hypercar class, and then United Autosport, of course. They have a very extensive history in the WEC. Also notable in all of this, I don't know if Mercedes, I don't really know why they didn't attend the tire test in Portimao, whether maybe they really just don't think that they have a great shot at being on the grid, but that probably isn't going to help their cause. And then I also thought something that was notable in this is that there's already a McLaren that has a spot on the Le Mans grid for next year, and that's the Inception Racing McLaren from IMSA. Of course, if the WEC doesn't approve, not the WEC, but FIA ACO doesn't approve McLaren, then they're not going to be able to run a McLaren. But that would certainly throw a wrench into their plans if McLaren were not one of the 9 teams that are approved. But yeah, it's interesting that you're only going to see these 9 manufacturers in the WEC and in the ELMS next year. So it's also going to be affecting the European Le Mans series. Of course, there are definitely some Mercedes that have run. Oh no, I'm thinking of the Le Mans Cup. I think the Michelin Le Mans Cup with the LMP3s and the GT3s, because ELMS ran GTE cars as well. But that'll certainly affect some of the teams that and what they were hoping to run next year. But Chris, what are your thoughts on limiting to just the 9?
As much as I don't like it, I think it makes total sense.
Yeah.
In a sentence, I think that's how I'll give it to you. I think it all comes down to BOP. It's not the easiest thing to balance the cars. You need a lot of data to do it. And especially going into a race like the 24 Hours of Le Mans, you don't want a manufacturer that's not part of the championship to run in, win the race because they had a big advantage and then steal the thunder from all the other teams. I mean, like it or hate it, it makes sense. And it does pain me to admit that. The funny thing I thought about the tire tests was Audi showing up with, I'm going to butcher the team name because it's French, Team Santaloc, I believe it is. Yeah. Funny to me because they do race in the Asian Le Mans series in the GT3 formula there, so it might have just been related to that. But part of me is like, okay, wait a minute, this is a French team? Are you trying to bargain a way onto the grid with a French team, even though you're not going to be racing in the Audi's not going to be racing in the hypercar category and has left some sour taste for that class recently. But no, I don't think it's really anything serious. I'm just making a mere joke out of it. Like you said, I'm fully expecting the 9 next year to be BMW, Corvette, Ferrari, Lamborghini, Lexus, Porsche, Aston, Ford, and McLaren. In terms of 9 manufacturers, they're only allowed 2 cars each, so no more than that for the full season. Obviously, like you said, for Le Mans, we might see the addition of some of the auto invites with like Inception Racing at McLaren, but only 9 for the entire season, including the 24. Don't really have a whole lot else to add. I think it makes sense as much as I really don't want to admit it.
Do you want to talk about I think a better transition is going to the full season grid that we got released. I think that was today as well. And then we can circle back to.
So there's no grid released. we got indication that there would be 37 cars. We're set for a 37 car grid next year. And that made me wonder, okay, so you're having 18 LMGT3 cars. If you have those 9 manufacturers with 2 each, you would have 19 hypercars. Quick math, there you go. Then I started going down the list of who are those 19 hypercars going to be. And I'm going to give what I am assuming we're going to see next year. And I would encourage the chat to make fun of me if you think I'm off my rocker, or confirm me if you think I'm correct. I think we're going to see we're definitely going to see 2 Alpines next year, running by the Signatech team, returning to the hypercar category with a proper LMDH car. 2 BMWs run by Team WRT. We're going to have 1 Cadillac by Cadillac Chip Ganassi Racing. 2 Ferraris, maybe 1 privateer. We've heard some rumblings that Ferrari wants a privateer 499P on the grid. Whether that comes next year, whether that comes 2025, that is something that I think weighs pretty heavily into whether we see 19 cars in the hypercar class next year. 1 Asada Fraschini, question mark. Sounds like they're intending on racing next year, but nothing formal yet, except for the fact that they have officially been recognized by the ACO social media on the 24 Hours of Le Mans social media pages, which is actually a pretty big indication that they're at least being recognized and not completely ignored in terms of them being granted a spot in the season next year. 1 Lamborghini run by Iron Lynx / Prema. 2 Peugeots with their 9X8s, the improved 9X8s, hopefully. 4 Porsches, the same 4 that we're already seeing this year with the 2 Penske Porsches, and then the 2 privateers, 1 from Jota and 1 from Proton. Hearing some other rumblings that we might get a second Jota 963 on the grid next year if the second Ferrari doesn't happen, or the privateer Ferrari doesn't happen. Maybe that's the additional privateer that we see. 2 Toyotas and 1 Vanwall, also with a question mark on that one as well. They've had quite a few issues with that new car getting it up to speed. So whether we see it on the grid next year or not confirmed yet, but judging off of where they were this year, I wouldn't be surprised to see them back for next year as well. And then, of course, the 18 GT3 cars that I just mentioned previously.
I think that'd be a pretty solid grid, I think.
Yep. Yeah, and it's an improvement from what we've seen this year. It's an improvement from what we've seen previous seasons. As I've said, this is a good issue for sports car racing to have, but it's still an issue nonetheless where we're turning teams away. I think the goal for following seasons is to try to bump that number up to about 40 full season entries. The more teams we can get out of the grid, the better as far as I'm concerned. But yep. One of the major issues is just logistics and trying to fit that many cars into all the garages at every track that you have on the calendar. A lot of the tracks that they go to are grade 1 tracks built to F1 standards and therefore are not designed to accommodate that many garage slots. Unless we want a repeat of what we had seen at Sebring, where they have tents and a temporary paddock setup, which I don't think we're probably going to see that again out of the WEC, at least in the near future. That's what we're working with.
I think is it Coda? Coda's one of the limiting tracks there, I think, with they have 37.
Coda, Imola, I believe, is another one of them.
Yep.
And there might have been one more. I can't quite remember. But that's the real factor right there. It comes down to trying to get all those cars in the garages and not having them share garages like we've seen, or share pit spaces like we've seen. Whoops, bumped the mic. In the Nürburgring 24, for example.
Yeah. Everything's bigger in Texas, but apparently not the paddock.
not the garage slots. So that's a lot of talk on the World Endurance Championship. I know you're the IMSA guy on the show. We've had quite a few IMSA announcements in the 3 weeks since we've been off. So I wanted to give you the opportunity to give us a bit of a lightning round on some of those IMSA driver announcements that we've had for next year.
Yeah, let's do some rapid fire driver announcements, and I think we're going to be getting a lot more here in the next week or so as we're going to be nearing probably a full season, or not a full season, but we're just going to see more silly season take place, I guess. First off, Ben Hanley and Nico Pino are going to be partnering up with Ben Keating in the United Autosport LMP2. You'll recall that Alex Quinn was previously supposed to be in that car coming over from PR1 Matheson, with Ben Keating as the Endurance Cup driver. Unfortunately, he got bumped up from an FIA Silver to a gold rated driver, so he is no longer eligible for most of the races. I think he's still eligible for the Rolex 24, but at that point he's not eligible for the other 4 endurance rounds. So they called on Nico Pino, a pretty young driver, to come in and fill that void. Still a very, very strong lineup there. Sticking with some United Autosport news, and Phil Hansen, who coming off WEC season, a pretty successful one with United, is going to JDC Miller Motorsports in the Banana Boat for the Michelin Endurance Cup rounds. He'll be joining Tiemann Vanderhelm, who is one of the confirmed full season drivers for that ride. The other full season driver has yet to be confirmed. Sticking with LMP2, Seth Lucas and Dennis Anderson are going to be the drivers for the High Class Racing and MDK Motorsports sort of combined effort LMP2 entry. A big one here, Tom Blomqvist going to Action Express Racing for the Michelin Endurance Cup rounds. We might want to touch on that one a bit in just a second. And then another big piece of news that came out today. We found out the 3rd drivers for both of the Wayne Taylor Racing Andretti cars, and that is Colton Herta and Brendan Hartley. They're going to be joining for the Endurance Cup Series rounds. Brendan Hartley joins the number 10 with Ricky Taylor and Philippe Albuquerque. And then Colton Herta is going to be joining the number 40 entry with Luis Delatraz and, of course, Jordan Taylor. There's a couple of big names in there. Of course, there's definitely going to be some ones that stick out, I think. Which ones are you most excited to see, I guess, moving to their new rides?
I'm excited about Tom Blomqvist moving to Action Express next year. He was sort of the driver at the end of the Rolex 24 this year. Whether you want to talk about things that may or may not have happened to his car or not. But what an extreme talent in a prototype right now, whether it's in the World Endurance Championship or whether it's in the IMSA Championship with Meyer Shank this past season. He is on loan to Action Express Racing, just for the endurance rounds, like you said. Still a full-time driver for Meyer Shank Racing, though, over in the IndyCar Series next year. Should Meyer Shank return to IMSA in 2025, I would expect Tom to go back to that team. Just what I'm assuming right now, unless things go really well over at Action Express and he decides he wants to try to extend that. The one that really surprised me the most, I think, was Colton Herta going over to Wayne Taylor Racing for the endurance rounds. Brendan Hartley, of course, no stranger to Wayne Taylor Racing, but Colton Herta leaving BMW Team RLL. He's been racing with them since when? I want to say it's been like 2018 he started racing with BMW?
Yeah.
2018,
2019, somewhere in there, yeah.
Okay. Of course, starting with the M8 GTE program and then moving over to the BMW M Hybrid V8 this year at the Rolex 24. So he's also, because Colton Herta was always just a driver who did Daytona, right? He wasn't a full-time endurance driver?
Believe so.
Okay. So it certainly wasn't at Petit Le Mans, I know that. Yeah, I believe.
Yeah, he definitely only did the Rolex this year.
Right. Yeah, so he was only really doing the Rolex previous seasons. Now he'll be doing all of the endurance races? Do they do 3 drivers at Watkins Glen?
Yeah, so that was actually another piece of news that came out, is they're going to be mandating 3 drivers for all of the Endurance Cup rounds this year.
Okay, I had seen that one as well. Just didn't know if I was confident enough to talk about it without having it in front of me. Watkins Glen and Indianapolis, for that matter, both being 6-hour races next year.
Yep.
Yeah, I think they're all 3 of them are great driver moves. Hartley's not really much of a move, but strong driver pairings going into next year, and I'm glad that Tom Blomqvist was able to get a seat in a prototype in the IMSA Championship where he belongs, at least for the endurance rounds for next season. The one small thing that got reported on alongside all of this, I think, was we had a rumor that Alexander Albon would be racing for Wayne Taylor Racing in the Rolex 24. From what I had seen today, it was an article on Racer. I can't remember exactly who put it out, but I'll put the links in the description.
Pruitt.
Marshall Pruitt tweeted about it, but it was their F1 reporter who actually reported on it. And I'm completely blanking on his name, but I will leave that in the comments and in the description on YouTube and podcast platforms so you can read it yourself. I don't think so.
No.
I can't remember who their F1 guy is, but a bit disappointing if we don't see Alexander Albon in the Rolex 24. I think he would have brought a lot of eyes to that race, but it sounds like the deal just sort of fell through on that one. Continuing with Williams next year in F1 doesn't really look like it's going to fit in with his preseason F1 obligations. Chris Medlin, thank you. This is why we have a live chat. Thank you for that one. Bit disappointing on that one, but I think that Wayne Taylor Racing still has an extremely strong driver lineup, and they're going to want to go into the Rolex next year, starting off the season with a bang after a disappointing season finale again this year at Petit Le Mans.
Something that I found interesting in that article as well is Albon, or I don't know if it was actually Albon that was spoken to in the article. I can't recall, or if it was more of a team rep, but it was kind of mentioned that preseason testing, it was just too tight of a turnaround for it to logistically work to go from the Rolex to F1 testing. I wonder if this could affect Kevin Magnussen as well. Kevin Magnussen, of course, isn't confirmed for anything on the grid for the Rolex, but he was supposed to be in the Rolex last year with running in a GTD Pro entry with his dad, and unfortunately, due to some hand surgery, he wasn't able to participate. But it's pretty clear that Kevin is interested in some sports car racing and doing it, especially with his dad. So I wonder if that means we might not see Magnussen try and make a comeback at the Rolex. But
I guess it might come down to when the F1 season starts with preseason testing, which I have no idea about. Sometime in March next year, I believe. Whether it's early March, middle March, don't really have an idea. Like you said, he's done it before, but I'm guessing that's just going to come down to when the season starts. We'll wait and see on that one, though.
Yeah,
it's probably also depends on team. It's a team by team basis where Williams might say, "Listen, you have to be in here, getting a seat fit and doing all these other things," whereas Haas might be a bit more lenient and say, "You can go do that funny endurance race in Daytona if you want." But that's a wait and see one. We'll see if we get anything on that one throughout the off season. So. All right. I think it's time. For me to talk about BOP a little bit more. There was a story a couple of weeks ago on motorsport.com that mentioned that a meeting occurred in late September where the ACO and FIA discussed some reforms to the BOP platform, I think specifically in the hypercar category. And I just wanted to discuss it here. I wanted to have a bit of an open discussion. Also, thank you for filling me in again here. We got F1 preseason testing from February 21st to 23rd next year, which leaves you about a 3-week gap from the Rolex 24. But that's up for the teams to decide whether that's too close for them to make that decision.
There's car launches and everything like that before that as well. So
So back to the BOP reform discussion. The general proposal seems to have been that the FIA and ACO are trying to remove the BOP circles that have so often happened in sports car racing, whether it's in IMSA or the WEC or GT World Challenge, where one car might be very dominant one race and very terrible the next race. From what was reported, this has been met with mixed reaction from the manufacturers. It seems like Toyota and Ferrari were in favor of some new changes, whereas Porsche was, they seem to be against lessening the impact of BOP. They were in favor of a more reactionary system where if a car's really slow one race, gets bumped up the next race. I wanted to read a pretty long quote from the Toyota team boss, Pascal Vassilonov, which few things I agree with him on, but this was certainly one of them in there. For that reason, it's pretty noteworthy. So here we go. He said, reliability is getting better and better. Team strategy is getting better and better. So we're going to end up in a situation where winning or losing a race will be the result of the inevitable inaccuracies of the BOP. And a BOP that promises zero performance gap between the cars is not realistic, and then you're in a never-ending story that people complain about the inaccuracies when they lose a race. Your readers don't only want to read stories about BOP, and I don't think the fans expect to have Le Mans fully decided by the BOP in top-level endurance racing between high-profile manufacturers. BOP should make sure that all manufacturers are in the same competitive ballpark, but with the responsibility for the last tenth, the one which makes you win or lose a race, should go back to the manufacturers. I wholeheartedly agree with that. This was one of my observations this season is, I think, for the top class, because BOP is no stranger at all. We've had BOP in IMSA for years in the top class. We've had BOP in the GT ranks for years, decades even. I think it's become a lot more vocal this year because of what I mentioned earlier, which is the whole expectations the thief of joy thing. The expectation is when you hear BOP, balance of performance. The performance of these cars is going to be balanced. What that sometimes offers is a false sense of hope that the cars are going to be completely balanced across the board. You're going to have Ferrari and Porsche and Toyota and Peugeot and every manufacturer, BMW, Lamborghini, are going to be qualifying around the track. They're going to be running race laps that are within a tenth or two of each other. And that's simply just not really possible. As much as I would love for that to be possible, and I think a scenario like that, if it was possible, would still favor teams with more experience like Toyota. It's never really been done. There have been certainly some races where the balance has been pretty spot on between all the manufacturers. Balance meaning overall pace. The cars are setting very similar lap times throughout a stint. There have been scenarios where that's been the case, but I don't think it's been consistent. I think that's just usually a chance thing that all the stars aligned and we finally have a race and the BOP parameters at this specific track work perfect. With a new championship or a lot of new manufacturers in the championship, you need to get a lot of data first before you're in a situation like that where you can balance the cars as close as you possibly can. And I think what we saw this year in the hypercar category is we saw a bit of a theoretical BOP, which was we want to balance these cars to a theoretical pace, what they can potentially extract out of the cars. Here's a problem I have with that. I don't know how you dictate what the theoretical pace of a car is. Obviously, the FIA and the ACO and any third parties that they have involved assisting with the BOP are going to have a lot more data than you or I would when it comes to trying to strike a balance between those cars. But I simply don't know how you can look at all of those manufacturers and determine that the theoretical maximum performance that they're able to get out of that car. Which leaves you down to one thing. You have to balance the overall pace of the cars and try to get them as close as they possibly can be to setting the exact same lap times throughout a stint. The issue with that is, we had a whole episode about this, where you mentioned you can't really punish a manufacturer like Toyota for having that much experience. We've seen what that looks like in the past. We saw it with the success ballast era and the I guess it still exists in GTM, but we saw it in the LMP1 class as well. And it really is not it's a pretty ugly formula, because you end up with, sure, other manufacturers are getting a win, but it's just not even close. You can see how much they're struggling to get performance out of the car. And I think where people are being frustrated right now is that sense of false hope, or that sense that they're being misled to what BOP is promising in the category. If you take a look at WEC social media from the Bahrain weekend, I will say that it seemed like it was a net negative, maybe until Iron Dames got that victory, which was a bit of the story shifter. But I think before that, if you look at the post-qualifying comments and the post-race was taken over by Iron Dames, the mid-race comments, there were a lot of people who were very frustrated about BOP. A lot of people commenting in Italian. I wonder who they were rooting for. um, but this is where you start to run into the ugliness of it to me. Is like Pascal said, this is the top class. These are fully fledged factory programs from some of the top automakers in the world fighting for victories in the biggest endurance sports car race in the world, being the 24 Hours of Le Mans. And if it's being dictated by BOP, it really starts to make people frustrated. It starts to make drivers frustrated, teams frustrated, fans frustrated. And it's not just Le Mans, it's also the entire championship. So how do you fix it? That's the main question. How do you take this issue that we have this season where the cars are not quite balanced, but also how can you balance them properly without Toyota getting frustrated that they're getting punished for having significantly more data and experience? How do you fix it? I don't know. I honestly wish I could sit here and tell you that I have the perfect solution to things. But I have a bit of an idea on how I would go about it. And I just want to get some feedback. And I'll invite you to chip in on this one as well. I think what you should do is something along the lines of this. You have the performance parameters in the category where you have the minimum weight that cars can be set to, and you have the maximum power that cars can output. It's 520 kilowatts in the power. It's 1,030 kilograms for the weight. So cars, for instance, like the Vanwell, like the 9X8 this year that were just struggling with pace, should get that maximum power. They should get the minimum weight. And anything beyond that is up to them to try to fix. Because the last thing I want to see is all the cars brought down to the performance level of the Vanwell. Because if you did that this year, you'd have an LMP2 car win every single race. Or maybe not quite, but the gap would certainly be a lot closer than it is right now. So you can't just do that realistically. You have to leave some reward in there for the manufacturers that are doing their homework. So that's what I would do. I would bring those cars down to the minimum weight and the maximum power. For the rest of the cars in the category, I would find an area, a performance window that you want those cars to sit in. And I would try to balance those cars as much as you can so that they're same on one lap pace. And I know that's controversial. I know that that's going to upset a lot of the Toyota team and a lot of Toyota fans, but I simply don't see another solution to avoid these sort of disparities on a race-to-race basis. I don't think you're going to get it to a point where you can properly balance the theoretical pace of each car, because I don't think that data is there. If it is there, I don't think they've done a good enough job this season showing us that they know how to figure it out, because we've seen larger gaps between the manufacturers, I think, at the end of the season than we were seeing at the beginning of the season, if you want to compare just strictly Toyota versus the rest of the field. So I think you're going to have to get to a point where you're actually balancing the cars properly, trying to get them in a very similar performance window. Now, what I like about what Pascal said is that last tenth or two should really be up to the teams, and I fully agree with that. I think that should be where the teams make it or break it. That's where you're going to win Le Mans or lose it, along with reliability and everything else. But even there, you have to determine how you're going to get those cars within that small of a window, that fine of a window that they can play with. So, I don't really know. I wish I had a better answer for it. Maybe I can sleep on it in the off season, but at the end of the day, it's not something that I have the power to make a decision on. So, that's really what I wanted to say about that. But I'm curious some of your thoughts as well.
Yeah, I want to kind of echo. I think Andrew has a comment that BOP is the only reason why you have so many manufacturers in GT3 and the top class. IMSA did it great, but they were all LMDH. I think, IMSA hit the nail on the head with the BOP, generally speaking, over the course of the season. And I don't want to just contrast IMSA or compare IMSA to the WEC, but IMSA did a great job with the LMDH only GTP class that they have. And I think for the most part, I mean, we didn't really get to focus on it that much in the WEC, but I think for the most part, between the Porsche and the Cadillac, the two LMDH cars, they were relatively even as well. But in terms of the overall BOP, that it's always difficult because you do want to leave. I agree. You want to have the BOP get the cars close and then have the final 10th or two be decided by the teams. But then I guess the concern in that is that you don't want to leave it too much open to the unique cars as well in a BOP'd class where it invites a spending war.
Yep.
And then we just go down this vicious road again where it's a spending war. None of the manufacturers want to do it anymore because it's too expensive and they start to drop out. So it's a very fine balancing act, yes, between making sure that the cars that are clearly better at, even if it's just at a certain track, or if Toyota, they have previous season data and they have all of that experience to fall back on. Yes, they should be rewarded for that. Absolutely. But it's a very fine line between rewarding that and, pushing down all the other manufacturers and frustrating, the teams, the manufacturers and fans, as well. With it being in a BOP class. I don't know how well I actually combine all my thoughts and put it together, but
I don't think I did a good job.
it's such a complex topic, BOP. There's of course there's so much that goes into it, and there's so much that affects it that I don't envy the governing bodies who are in the positions to make the BOP, and I think there were moments during the season where it was getting close, or it was close. You saw Ferrari take pole at Sebring. You saw, multiple battles at various points in the season to a certain extent between Toyota and other teams. I think Porsche did apply some serious pressure to them at Fuji. But overall, I think the hope would be this is a big learning curve for the FIA and the ACO as well, determining, trying to BOP the hypercars versus the LMDHs. And I think hopefully this is a big learning experience for them this year, and that all of the data that they've gathered, everything that has been learned this year, can be applied and bettered going into next season and beyond.
Right, because the issue with next year is we have more manufacturers showing
up,
and so it's not going to become any easier. Look, I don't really want to talk about BOP again, not to this extent, but I think the cat's out of the bag a little bit when you look at social media. Like I said, people are starting to pick up on the fact that there is this big bad BOP out there that we have to call out every single race. Our favorite team is not within within a couple hundredths of a second of the top manufacturer. And that's why I'm so concerned about it, is I think that's going to become the primary talking point if it's not addressed. How you address it, again, that's up to you. But I think we're going to
something
reach
that's never going to go away.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I don't want to reach a spending war as well. And that's why I'm saying you can't get rid of BOP. All the manufacturers agreed to it, and they all signed up for it. And that's pretty much why they signed up for it, under the premise that you're not going to have to spend hundreds of millions of dollars like you were in LMP1 trying to gain a couple seconds. Here's what I'll say about IMSA is the nice thing I saw about IMSA, especially in the latter half of the season, is they were making very minuscule changes to the BOP between the GTP cars at each race. I mean, we were talking like
a kilogram.
The tiniest of power, the tiniest of power adjustments, a kilogram or two out of the cars. And there were certainly races where there was a dominant manufacturer. I think one of the ones I'll point out was Indy, and that's where Porsche really just sort of swept the field there. What did Porsche have at Indy that none of the other manufacturers had? They had a ton of testing experience there. So I think the cream really rises to the top of the crop. Is that what the saying is? The cream rises to the top.
Yep.
Yeah. not the crop.
The crop.
The cream rises to the top. And I think we saw that sort of thing with Porsche at Indy. And the other thing is, there's going to be tracks where certain cars just have advantages. Nobody,
Bingo.
and I mean nobody, is going to argue with you when you say that Red Bull has been the most dominant team this year, especially in the hands of Max Verstappen on the F1 grid. Where was Red Bull at Singapore this year? They just seemed to have no pace. It wasn't a track that really suited their car that well. And that's going to happen with any car in any championship. Is there's going to be certain races where they're just not performing as well. The car doesn't really work as well with the track that they're racing on, or the conditions they're racing in. The problem that we're seeing right now in the hypercar category is if there's that disparity, it's immediately getting pointed at to BOP. BOP is immediately getting the finger pointed at it and said, this is the issue. This is why we were so far off pace. And in some cases, they're accurate to say that. There have been cases, I know Toyota was the fastest car in a straight line at Bahrain, and they won pretty comfortably. So do I think there's work to be done? Yes. Do I think that it's the root of all evil, BOP? Absolutely not. I just want there to be some shift, because the last point I'm really going to make about it is I think that there's been a bit of a change in the goalposts this season. Where last year, like I said, pundits within the series and commentary teams and everybody was saying, just wait until next year. You're going to see Toyota's not going to have this advantage at every race. This is going to be the golden era and all this stuff. And we fell a bit short of that this year. And I think that the goalpost sort of changed to Toyota has a lot more data. These other teams have to catch up. The problem I have with that is that's pretty much always going to hold true. Is Toyota's always going to have more data than the other teams, except for, maybe I guess when you go to tracks next year, and we'll have to see what Qatar looks like in Imola and Coda, where the hypercars have never, in Brazil, where the hypercars have never raced before. But I just don't want to see an excuse made for it. I think you have to address the issue when there is one. Mm-hmm. Just hoping to see some changes in the offseason to the way they approach BOP, because I think if we don't see that, I don't think it's going to be very positive, the commentary going around the series next year. And I think that's the last thing we want to see with a category as bright as we have right now.
Yep. So
I want to go to a couple of comments here, because I might have upset people. I might not have. People might agree with me, but I want to get some opinions on this one. Let's see. Don't punish the winner, improve the losers. I guess it's probably the same thing at the end of the day. We're talking about, let's take the fastest car right now, which is the Toyota, and let's take the slowest car, which is the Van Wall. If you bring the Van Wall and you improve their performance further, then it's still a net negative to Toyota, who's spent more time and money developing their car than Van Wall has, and they have a stronger driver lineup and a lot more R&D, and they have 2 cars on track versus 1.
But at least you're not loading a ton of extra weight onto the Toyota or anything as well.
No, I get that. But the Van Wall is already at the maximum. I believe it's at the maximum power they can run, and I believe it's at the minimum weight they can run. So unless you break the rules in that regard, which has only been done, to my knowledge, once, which was the Glickenhaus at Monza in 2022, where I think they were running at 533 kilowatts that race. There's not really that much more you can do. But like I said, I don't necessarily want to see a world where the Van Wall is on the exact same pace level as the Toyota, because I don't think it would be fair. Yeah. I think you need to get them to a point where you can say, look, we've done what we can to bring you into this window. There's obviously, you're still struggling with some power issues with your car. That's for you to figure out. And that's where I think BOP doesn't need to extend that far. We already discussed on what Andrew had said. Or have individual race packages where each car on each track, or for each car on each track, which would require a lot of testing and money. So individual race packages, meaning individual BOP for every car on each track. I mean, that's sort of what we're doing right now. I don't know if you mean that, or if you mean, I don't know. You'd have to elaborate on that one a little bit. But I think the issue with that or not the issue with it, but I think that's what we're largely seeing right now. And for this season, there just wasn't enough data, plain and simple. You're really running off simulations on what the theoretical pace of the car is going to be at Bahrain or Fuji or whatever it may be before you even put the car on the ground there. And I think that's where we saw some of the issues with BOP disparity this year. IMSA's BOP is based on simulation of compiled data sets and then done for each round. Setup meant so much more. Yeah, so that's where I'm saying these not the teams, but the sanctioning bodies have a lot more data, infinitely more data than any fan will ever have access to. And that's where I would like to see them try to implement a system that can get it more consistent. If you're going to have, this is what it comes down to at the end of the day. If you're going to have BOP, you need to have it consistently good. Because if you don't, then, as we said in the BOP episode that we had for the first episode back, if you get the balance wrong, you're never going to hear the end of it. Because it's not going to be the team's fault or the driver's fault that the car was slow. It's going to be your fault. And I think that the teams need to invest, not the teams, I keep saying the teams. I think the sanctioning bodies and the series themselves need to be spending a lot more effort and perhaps a lot more money trying to figure out a proper solution as well, because it's certainly not going to improve otherwise, I don't think. They need to have a more concrete method of BOP and not just afraid of someone dominating a race or two. Yeah, and that's sort of what I was hinting on as well. You just need a consistent package that's going to... The thing I liked about the WEC this year is that it was at least... Like, you could go into the weekend and it would make sense. It would, for the most part, it would make sense. It would make sense that Toyota had that pace advantage. It would make sense that Ferrari was second for the most part on performance. You were sort of expecting it. The thing I really didn't like about BOP in the past, whether it be a GT formulas or whatever, was the pendulum effect that you had, where you had one race was Toyota dominating, the next race they were extremely slow. I will give them credit that there was at least a level of familiarity with this one where you could go into a race weekend and Toyota wouldn't be on the complete back foot one race and then extremely dominant the next. That's what you need to do. I hate the pendulum effect of BOP. If you get it wrong one race, you just need to make a bit of an adjustment to try to fix it the next race. And I think that's sort of what they're still trying to figure out, but are a little bit short of right now. Yep. BOP was fine. IMO, this is from Andrew as well. Other teams are missing the data and setup. It really does mean a ton, plus individual cars, software, and some of the other things behind the scenes at the teams. Listen, if I'm going to take anybody's word for it, I'm going to take Andrew's.
Yep.
Beyond my own and beyond yours, too. I mean, this is a guy who's worked for a GTP team and knows the whole process. And admittedly, I don't. So, yeah, I think if that's where you're standing right now and you think that the other teams were simply down on data right now, would I believe it? Yeah. Toyota rolled into Bahrain with, 2 years of prior setup experience of that track. Other teams are rolling in. I know Ferrari did a test there. Porsche, I believe, did a test there as well. But you're talking about teams that just don't have anywhere near as much data to work off of. And the 9X8 as well, what I noticed, qualified a second slower than they did last year at Bahrain, despite having presumably a lot more data and better BOP this year as well. So there are other factors that play into it. Obviously, the whole tire warmer thing in the WEC this year probably played a bit of a hand in that one. But yeah, it's a very weird gray area that you need to work into, but I just think I don't want BOP to become the thing that gets blamed every race, and unfortunately that's where we are right now.
Yeah, no, I don't think anybody wants to get to the point where we don't want to be talking about this every week. We want it we want it to be, we don't really want it to be in the discussion at all. You want it to, it's hopefully this trend of it gaining, especially after Le Mans, right? I think the BOP discussion came into the light quite a bit more, and hopefully that doesn't carry through into next year.
Well, it came through at Le Mans because I think that's the first real. I
Yeah.
mean, talk about new fans. That's the first
Oh
indication
yeah.
that they had that this is how the system works sometimes. Because you had Ferrari at Le Mans, and they were the class of the field. They qualified, got a 1-2 sweep on the front row out of qualifying. The 51 car went off in the first chicane during the race and had to get towed out, and still ended up clawing that time back to the number 8 Toyota and won the race by a healthy margin. And then you go to the next race in Monza, and they were significantly down on top speed compared to Toyota. I think they got weight added and power decreased going into Monza, and that's the first real indication. How do you go from winning Le Mans to being this far down below Toyota at the next race? I think that was the critical moment, to be honest with you.
Yep.
Sports so reliant on BOP that it sometimes seems made the scapegoat at all times, or at times. Yep, that's the main point I'm trying to make, is I don't want to reach a point where that is the be-all, end-all. BMW is working on software every single round so hard, how the traction control interacts, how the engine works with a hybrid system, brake-by-wire systems. So much is in the software that can be missing. And that's the other key aspect. These cars are super technical as well compared to GT cars as well. When you talk about BOP being around in the GT formula for years and years, well, the one thing about those cars is that they're a lot simpler than what we have here. The formula is a lot closer. I know Andrew mentioned earlier that it's very difficult to balance four-wheel drive hybrid or four-wheel drive hypercars against rear-wheel drive LMDH cars. And I don't think there should be an excuse made for that, because ultimately I think what we're seeing right now with the WEC only letting you use that four-wheel drive above 190 kilometers per hour for most cars. It's 135 or 130 for the 9X8 right now, but I believe they're going to go for the wider tires next year and have that bumped up as well. It shouldn't be making as much of a difference anymore. If it makes a difference for tire wear in some of the corners, that might be a separate issue, but certainly not to the level that we were seeing back in the LMP1 days, where it was properly impossible to balance the cars with race performance because of that four-wheel drive instantly off the corners, which is too much of an advantage. I don't want to talk about BOP anymore, though. I really don't enjoy talking about it, but I felt compelled to, because I thought that Pascal made a rare good point there, that the system is a bit flawed right now. And you have a long off season for the WEC. They won't be racing for another 5 months now. I think there's ample time to improve the system. And Andrew, I love BOP.
I think we need some stickers.
I'm gonna put it on a shirt.
Yeah.
Rain Race Podcast merch is coming in time for the holidays. We're gonna get that on a shirt. I want to move to a bit of a happier topic, though. Before we get on to some of the questions at the end of the show, Stu, I actually didn't tell you about this one. I will put you on the spot, but
surprise.
I think this is for the better. We talked about Bahrain being the final GTE race of all time, and I'm just going down memory lane. I've been watching sports car racing since 2008 at Lime Rock Park for the American Le Mans Series Northeast Grand Prix. And back then, GTE cars were racing in the GT2 class, and we've had so many manufacturers join. Since then, we've had manufacturers in and out of the series, and we've had some fantastic moments throughout the years. So I just wanted to reminisce a little bit. I wanted to use a bit of a show here to talk about some of those moments, talk about some of my favorite moments. I'll get some of yours as well, and I would love for some people in the chat to talk about some of their favorite moments out of the GTE formula as well. I'll start for myself here. I know, talking about favorite cars in the GTE formula, I gotta be honest, I was a real fan, and it's a bit of a casual answer to say, or I don't want to say predictable, but it's a bit of an easy answer to say this. The Ford GT that was introduced in 2016. Don't really know what it was about the car. I just loved the way it looked. I didn't hate the way it sounded compared to most other people. So, and I like the driver lineups, and I like the story behind it. But I'll tell you, the biggest thing about being a Ford GT fan was the rivalry that came with being friends with Corvette fans and the fun times that were brought amongst that. I mean, some of my closest friends are diehard fans of Corvette, and I remember we would get into the most heated arguments in Instagram group chats about, oh, Ford's terrible, Corvette sucks, they ran wide. And it was it was some of the most entertaining GTE moments I can remember from my time watching sports car racing. I mean, this is back 2016 to 2000. It sort of died off in the later years when I became more of a prototype racing fan, but 2016, 2017, really the peak of that for me. And I remember in particular the 2017 Rolex 24 at Daytona. I believe it was down to the 60. I'm gonna get my. How do I not remember this? I'm gonna pull up the Wikipedia article. The 2017 Rolex 24 was down to the. Was it the number 3 Corvette? I want to say. Pulling up the race results. Such a terrible.
This is going a while back. 2016 was a while ago now.
Okay, yeah. 2017 is what I was talking about.
2017, sorry.
So you actually had a lot of cars in the battle. There was a late race restart. I want to say it was like an hour-ish to go, but admittedly, I haven't seen this race in a long time. Point in place, I was a fan of the 66 Ford GT, and there was a battle between a bunch of manufacturers for that GTLM win between Ford and Porsche and Ferrari, and the number 3 Corvette was there as well. And I'm just looking at how many cars we had on the same lap at the finish. I think there were 11, so cars 5th through 11th. We had 6 cars, if I'm doing my quick math there right. 6 cars on the lead lap at the end of the race. And I just remember my heart like almost beating out of my chest watching the end of that race because there was a lot of pressure on Ford to get that. That was going to be their second 24-hour race victory, of course, after Le Mans in 2016. Bit controversial on that one, but I remember looking back at that race, and that was some of the most intense moments of me being a sports car racing fan, just particularly because of the rivalry that was associated with being a Ford GT fan in that time. And knowing that if they fumbled the race at the end there, that I was never going to hear the end of it. So that one really stood out as a prime moment for me. But also looking back at some of the extremely good battles that we had over the years. I remember watching the end of 2009 ALMS at Laguna Seca, the iconic and slightly infamous battle between the Flying Lizard Porsche RSR and the Corvette as well, driven by Jan Magnussen. I was a Flying Lizard fan back in the day. In fact, I actually believe I could dig out a Flying Lizard RSR t-shirt in my closet from like 2008 if I dug hard enough. So seeing moments like that, I mean, of course, weren't really a fan of how that one ended, but that was just one of many GTE battles that we had over the years that was truly iconic.
I think for me, it's a little bit more of a recent one. And in 2021, I believe it is. I couldn't remember the exact year, so did a little quick Google, and I'm pretty sure this is I'm pretty sure it was the 2021 12 Hours of Sebring, where there was BMW and the number 3 Corvette that were battling towards the end. There was some contact that came about between the two of them, but I just remember that battle sort of unfolding, and you could, if the writing wasn't on the wall at that point that GTLM was going to be going away from IMSA, then you could certainly see that the writing was sort of on the wall at that point. And, sort of, that was the last season, I believe. Yeah, that was the last season where we saw, BMW take on a full Endurance Cup schedule. And, or was that the last year of GTLM? I can't remember. I might be crossing some wires.
No, GTLM raced until 2021. Oh yeah, 2021. Yes. Yeah, so it was.
Yeah, so that was the last year. Okay.
Right.
So yeah, the writing would have definitely been on the wall at the time. But seeing this battle that unfolded and just thinking, man, there's some great battles in this class, and it's going to be a shame to see them go. But it's and then also a funnier moment with that BMW, just how large it was compared to some of the other cars. It was those will live on forever. That memory will live on forever.
Oh yeah, absolutely. The big boy M8 memes will never truly die, even if they were slightly replaced by the Garage 56 Camaro memes this year. No, I was at that 12 Hours of Sebring back in 2021. I was in turn 17 on the bridge in that turn, and I was with one of those said friends that was a diehard Corvette fan, and I just remember him being extremely mad at the end of that race because that was at a point where Corvette was just vying for victory in that race, and I don't believe they'd achieved victory in that race for quite some time. In fact, I think you'd have to look back to 2000. I wish I knew things better. I want to say it was 2017 since they last won Sebring before that, but I might be off. Or was it? Did they win 2020? No, Porsche won 2020, didn't they?
Well, 2020, that was like the last race of the season.
Yeah. Anyways, I wish I had better knowledge or better memory of those things. But point in place, like I said, the rivalries that came with those manufacturers were truly some of the most fun moments to me. But I'm also thinking back, even if you're not thinking rivalries, just looking at how many cars we had racing at Le Mans in 2018 and 2019. We had 4 factory Porsches and 4 factory Fords, and I think 3 Ferraris and 2 Corvettes, and that was GTE at its prime, I think, and it really wasn't that long ago. You're talking 2018, 2019 here, and particularly the opening lap of the race, when you had all those cars going down the Mulsanne straightaway for the first time, and it just doesn't look like they're going to end. There's so many of them. We talk about how strong the hypercar lineup was at Le Mans this year. I think GTE Pro certainly had more cars in 2018 and 2019 than we had in the hypercar category this year. So that was really where it was in those years when LMP1 was sort of in its dying embers, and all the manufacturer interest was over in the GTE Pro class at the time. I'm also thinking back to the end of 2017 Le Mans with Corvette and Aston Martin battling for the very final minutes of the race for that. I keep saying overall win. I'm so used to talking about GTP and hypercar for the GTLM win, or GTE Pro win. Sorry. And again, me being an Aston Martin fan and talking with people who were Corvette fans at the time, and it was just some of the most iconic moments. But I want to switch over to some of the people in the chat. I know some people have been giving their thoughts on it as well. Wild Stallion, I'll greatly miss GTLM. I've not been as interested in IMSA since it went away. And I know you're not the only one who's echoed that sentiment. I know that there's people who are big GT racing fans, whether that just be because the cars are more familiar or there's more brand identity with those cars than you might get in a prototype formula. I do know that there's a lot of people who were more invested in sports car racing back in the prime GTE days. So, well, I would say that sports car racing is at a great high right now, and we have fantastic manufacturer interest in the top class. It is certainly a little bit upsetting that we don't have the excitement, or not quite as high as an excitement in GTE as we used to back 5 or so years ago. Yeah, 2017 GTLM Daytona was great. 6 to 8 cars in GTLM battling at the end. They were almost as fast as the DPI cars in the rain in that race. The DPIs were new and had the Continental tires at the time. I'll talk about being as fast as the prototypes. 2015 Petit Le Mans, when a GTE or GTLM Porsche RSR won overall above the I think it was the 31 Action Express, not Cadillac, Corvette DP.
Yeah,
that was the prototype leader in that race. There were a lot of wild moments like that. Don't have to look that far back to remember those. Corvettes battling at the end for the win in the 2016 Rolex was fantastic. Can't believe I haven't mentioned that one yet. The inter-team battle between the 3-car and the 4-car, with the number 4 barely getting to the line first. I think it was like half a car length, a couple hundredths of a second. And they were battling lap after lap in those final stages. And the thing you were just hoping they weren't going to do is take each other out. And they somehow managed to keep it clean. And I think that really set the bar for who Corvette Racing was as a team. They weren't afraid to let those cars battle in Corvette's, I guess you could say, maybe second biggest race of the year, but certainly biggest IMSA race of the year for that team. Can't help but love the RMS M8. Yeah, the big M8. There you go. M8 should have won more races than it did. Seemed to be a snake bit in some of the late race crashes. Yeah, I think that the BMW M8 was really a short-lived GTE car. It debuted, what was it, back in 2018 it debuted. 2017 was the final year with the M6, and of course it only ran the endurance races in 2021. So Yeah, I think that car had some more time left in it, but of course the ties sort of turned over to the GTP hypercar class around 2021. Manufacturers started shifting their focus over there, and I think that car probably could have offered us a bit more than it did. Although it's certainly one of the more memorable ones that we look back at, just because of
Oh yes.
the funny haha things that we got from that car. Fun fact: the Ford GT never won a race that ended at night, which is actually, I'm thinking back at it, and yeah, that checks out, because they didn't win Sebring, they didn't win Petit, and I'm guessing they wouldn't have won. I'm trying to think of other races that would have ended at night. I'm thinking like WEC at Coda and WEC Bahrain.
No. Yeah.
Well, yeah, Bahrain would have ended at night. So yeah, interesting. I didn't really think about that one. Yeah, I think that's enough for me, though. I'm going to touch a bit more on that, though, in the video that I have coming out honoring the GTE formula across IMSA and the WEC. Finally, going to do a final ask for questions. And while we do that, I'm going to read over some of the pre-episode questions that we got. Since we're an hour and 36 minutes into this episode, which is a bit, we're on call for or on record for the longest episode since we've come back. Anyways, Stu, I'm going to let you take this first fan question that we had from YouTube. This was on your community post that you put up this morning, and I know it relates to IMSA, so I'm going to let you take that one first.
Yeah, so I believe they've been with us throughout the evening tonight, and that's from Whiskey McMoonshine, like the name there. And they asked, with this being the second year in a row Wayne Taylor Racing has lost the championship in the final round because of their bold maneuvers, do you think Wayne Taylor Racing will take a more conservative approach to the season and take points when they can? They've consistently had a car to win the championship, but have thrown away precious points because of their aggression, putting them behind the points lead in the final round and forcing themselves to make these high-risk moves. Interesting question here. I think so. A few things to take away from this. The first area where my brain goes is what has happened this year. What happened to Wayne Taylor Racing that got them to the point where they were they weren't really behind the 8-ball going into the final race. They were right there neck and neck with Action Express Racing, and I can't remember which one of the Porsches was right there with them, but they were right there neck and neck. Of course, you go back to the Sebring crash, the infamous into the evening, takes out both of the Porsches in the final, hour at least of the race. They still managed. Less than that. They still managed to finish fourth, but they had a pretty good shot at winning that car was coming alive. It was arguably a bit of an over-aggressive move. It wasn't entirely on Wayne Taylor Racing and Albuquerque at the time. I was, I believe, driving the car. Wasn't completely on him, but you could still categorize it as a pretty aggressive move. You look at Long Beach, late in the race, actually just a couple laps to go. The dive up the inside, Ricky Taylor this time, and just overcooked it right into the wall, brings out the full course yellow, and that race is over. Was it an over-aggressive move? I don't know. He maybe only had one more. There was a couple of good passing or okay passing opportunities around that track, but it wasn't the last lap. He wasn't forced to make the move in that moment, and he was coming from a really long way back, and he clearly had the faster car, fresher tires. I don't know if I'd necessarily call it an over-aggressive move, but it was maybe a little aggressive. Watkins Glen, I actually meant to look into what happened at Watkins Glen, but they did have issues for sure there. But I think the other main problem race for them was at Petite, of course, caught up in the infamous wreck one of the infamous wrecks, I would say, coming out of that race. They got together with the 31. There's a lot of back and forth on whose fault it is. I think at the end of the day, it was still two drivers played a role in it. It was a pretty aggressive move going around the outside into turn one. and ultimately it didn't lead to a great ending for them. You start to put it together. Yeah, there was a lot of aggressive moves that did not work out for them this year as a result of it. As a result of some of those moves. Do I think that they're going... Actually, before I move away from that point, there was a lot of aggressive moves that they made, but you're a race car driver. You're there out there trying to win races. I think there's a fine line between aggressive and over aggressive. That's a fine line that you have to walk. Maybe at times they crossed over it a little bit and it bit them. But I don't think you want to see some of that aggression taken away either. I think things just didn't work out that well for them. They did definitely have a car that was consistently good enough to win a championship. They were the only car that was in the hunt for the championship at the end of the day that didn't have a race win under their belt. And that was because of the consistency that they showed in basically all the other races that I didn't touch on, that enabled them to get to that point. So many podiums, so many great races. I don't think they're going to take a more conservative approach to the season and take points when they can. I think they did a really good job of maximizing the points where they could get them this season. And if you have one of those moves, they might have arguably had a bit of bad luck with how some of these quote unquote aggressive moves turned out. But I think if you have one of those moves, one of those three moves turn out in your favor, then you're the champion this year. And I don't think that they'll change anything in their style I don't think they'll change anything in their style going into next year. And I think they'll be contenders for the championship yet again.
Counterpoint. You're talking about consistency. I think that's where Wayne Taylor Racing lacked this year. I think if you look back at Long Beach, you look at Sebring, I think those were missed opportunities. Particularly Long Beach was just a misjudgment on Ricky Taylor's hand, but threw away a second place and a handful of points that they would have gotten. Now, what I want to say is you can't ever put yourself in a ride or die situation at Petit Le Mans, which I think is what Wayne Taylor Racing has done certainly the last 2 years, maybe beyond that one as well. But Petit Le Mans in the final hour when it's dark out and there's usually a late race restart, it's just too hectic to count on that being your make it or break it for winning the championship. I think you need to be in a position where you can sit back a little bit at the end of Petit Le Mans and just take a 5th place finish, take a 6th place finish even, and gather up enough points that you're able to win the championship. Because we've had a lot of late race incidents at Petit Le Mans. This happened in 2020. It happened, of course, this year as well. And I think that it's too risky to just count on that. So I look back at incidents like Sebring and Long Beach, and I think that those were avoidable for Wayne Taylor Racing. And I think if they had settled for a podium at both of those races, and they certainly would have been settling for 2nd place at Long Beach, I don't think they would have been in that position at Petit Le Mans where they had to push. Like you said, I think that's where they could have gone and settled for a 5th place finish. I'd have to go back and recalculate all the points, which frankly I'm not going to do.
Yeah.
To see exactly what it would have taken for them to win the championship at Petit. But what did I say in the Petit race review? I said it was a little bit of it was too much of a gamble. A gamble they sort of had to take because ultimately they were in a position with the 31 car, which whoever finished ahead would win the championship. But for the future, for next year, I would say what that team needs to do, especially with having 2 cars on the table now, is they need to try to figure out how to construct a consistent championship from day one and not really go for a race win if it's going to potentially lose you the race. I know it's very tempting when you've been trailing a car like that for as long as they were at Long Beach, but
there's also
look at it,
their sponsors or their car manufacturers track.
Well, yes, but I mean, what do you want to win? Do you want to win at Long Beach or do you want to win the championship? So I think that it's been a bit too short-sighted from them this season, and I'm hoping that's where they reevaluate in the offseason because not every race is going to go your way. You're not going to win every race. And if you look at the season results, the 31 car only won one race. They only won Sebring. So you don't need to win 3, 4, 5 more races in the season to be a championship contender. They proved this year that you don't need to win any races to be a championship contender. I can see where you're saying, where they had consistency in the fact that they were still in the championship hunt at the end of Petit without winning a race. But I looked back at those moments that were missed opportunities, and I think that if they didn't have those mishaps, they would have been even stronger.
Yeah.
So
yeah, you have an extra 80 or 90 points under your belt, then yeah, you're looking good into that final race. You're right.
Yep. And like I said, that's what it comes down to me. You can't count on a last minute pass for the win to win the championship at Petit Le Mans because it's too unpredictable. And oftentimes people are racing too aggressive at the end of that race where it just doesn't really pay out in your favor. Actually, we saw that in 2021 as well with the late race dive bomb to try to win the championship that didn't pay off. So,
mind you, that was at the final possible moment.
Well, sure. I'm not saying they shouldn't have done that, but I'm saying it would have been better if they weren't in a position where they had to do that, is my point. Yeah. So I'll give them credit for trying, but the odds are not in their favor for those last-minute passes to try to win the championship in the final race. And I'm not sure if that's going to change. So, got another question from Hill Climb Club on Twitter. Do you think that LMGT3 will run similar lap times and similar speeds to GTE or be slower? It's pretty... You got a lot of data to compare here if you want to try to make that judgment. Short answer is that the GT3 cars will be slower. I'm looking at the lap times. I'm comparing two notable things here. Comparing 2022 lap times between the Spa 6 hours for the WEC and the Spa 24. I know that you're setting up cars separately for those races. I know there's a completely separate BOP formulas being applied. But in terms of top-level GT racing at that track, those are the two best I could find. So the GTE Pro pole at Spa last year, 2022, was a 214.3 by the Porsche team. GTE M pole was a 217.4. And the Spa 24 pole, which I believe was a Ferrari last year, was a 216.4. So you can see it slots right between GTE Pro and GTE M. With the success ballast in GTM, I'm guessing that ties into part of it. Also, of course, GTE Pro teams just generally had a lot more data to work off of. The cars were set up probably quite a bit better than the cars were in GTM. But I would say for next year, comparing between GTM and GT3 is probably going to be about a second or two slower, if I had to guess. Also looking at Le Mans this year. This is a more direct comparison between GTM and GT3. GTM pole at Le Mans this year was a 352.3 by Ben Keating. And the Road to Le Mans GT3 pole, which was run on the same weekend, was a 355.8. So a difference of 3.5 seconds there at a longer track like Le Mans. So there you go. I don't think there's a whole lot more to unpack there. I would say it's going to be a little bit slower, but not really noticeably slower, especially over a track as long as Le Mans. Mainly the corners is where you'd expect GT3 cars to be a bit slower nowadays. In fact, in a straight line, they actually, I believe, should probably be a little bit faster at Le Mans. So keep an eye out for that next year. Toyota GR010 on Twitter asked if we could discuss Dorian Pan and Lilu Adu in the Lamborghini GTP car next year, the SC63 and the Ferrari 499P. Ferrari is ready for a third hypercar, apparently. Touched on that a little bit earlier. And surely Lambo's second hypercar will follow suit. So I want to start out here by talking about Dorian. She raced, obviously, in the LMP2 class for Prema this year. Prema is dropping their LMP2 programs in all series next year to focus on the Lamborghini LMDH programs. One car in both the IMSA endurance rounds and the FIA World Endurance Championship run by Iron Lynx with Prema support. She was also a driver in the Iron Dames lineup, raced in the IMSA endurance races this year in the GTD class in the Iron Dames Lamborghini. I would say with how things are panning out right now, I would expect Dorian to race in the Iron Dames team next year for the IMSA endurance races, assuming they end up back. Which, has that been confirmed yet? It should have been confirmed at Petit Le Mans.
Yeah, I can't remember if they were confirmed for only select races or if they were for all of the endurance races, but they were definitely on that list.
Okay. Yeah, I would expect to see her remain in that car. The standout performance from her this year, I mean, you can talk about the 6 hours of Spa, the stint that she put in an opening couple laps of that race in the LMP2, which was only her third LMP2 race. Very impressive at the start of that race. But the start of Petit Le Mans, just being there in person and seeing her not only overtake all of the pro cars, not all the pro, but you know what I mean, like overtaking the pro cars at the start of the race, being at the front of the GT lineup overall, and then pulling a pretty sizable gap before we got that first yellow. Extremely impressive, and shows that she's certainly more than capable in a GT3 Lamborghini, if nothing else. Lamborghini, I know, is applying for a second car to race at Le Mans this year. Could we maybe see her in that car? Potentially. I'm not really too sure. I think she's remaining as a silver rated driver next year. There's nothing that says that she can't race in the hypercar lineup with a silver license. I think it's just going to depend where all the drivers get shuffled for that race. Still not really sure what the driver lineups are going to look like in the WEC or IMSA. I would say it's potential. I wouldn't bet on it, but keep your eye out for it. It's a possibility, I would say. As for Lila Adu, she actually participated in the WEC rookie test this past weekend at Bahrain on the Sunday after the race. She tested the Ferrari 499P. She was the third fastest rookie. I want to put that in quotes because almost all the time, the rookies in the rookie test are not actually rookies to the WEC. They're just rookies to that class for the most part. But then you also have some of the like full-time drivers also setting laps in the cars as well. So take it with a grain of salt. Third fastest rookie in the hypercar category behind Robert Schwartzman and Norman Nato. Fifth fastest overall, which if you include the full season drivers who are already on the team, she would have been fifth. She also tested the Toyota GR010 last year in the rookie test at Bahrain. So she's I want to say she's the first person, period, to have experience in two different hypercars.
I think that is correct, yeah.
Yeah, with the hypercar formula being relatively new at least. Certainly the first woman with experience in two different hypercars.
Sorry, no, it was who?
I'm gonna feel like an idiot any second now.
He raced with Van Wall at Bahrain, and he raced
Ryan Briscoe.
Yeah,
Ryan Briscoe. You're right. Completely forgot about that one. Thank you for calling me out on that. She also had prototype experience in LMP2 last year with the Richard Mille racing team, which was run by Signatech last year, and in the IMSA Championship as well, some additional LMP2 experience with AF Course at Watkins Glen this year in IMSA for the 6 hours. Right now, this season, she is a Ferrari factory driver. So I'd say if a privateer Ferrari 499P materializes, I would say, again, possibly. It would certainly be a storyline that I think the manufacturers would want to get out. But as I said for Dorian Pan last episode, neither of these two drivers are people who have to be rushed into the seat. They're both very young. They have plenty of years ahead of them. And so I think that there's not really going to be a push to get them in a seat as fast as possible. I think that if they spend another season or so trying to get some additional experience under their belt, we might see them in either a privateer or a factory car in future seasons would be a little bit more likely.
I also can confirm Iron Dames will be on for all of the endurance rounds next season.
There you go.
In IMSA.
All 5 of them.
Yep.
All right. So I'm going to do a last sweep through because I can't remember if there were any questions earlier that didn't go over. But now is the time when I usually do it. This is usually when we have some awkward pauses in the episode.
I can...
yeah, go ahead.
I can say something about the sort of the closure of the GTE or the removal, the retirement of the GTE cars and the transition to the GT3 equipment. I think we're always going to look back on, the years that we had with GTE, and I think there's going to be a lot of fond memories. There's going to be some amazing moments that we're going to be able to look back on, both in the WEC and in IMSA. But I think it's also important to be excited about what we're going into as well. I know it doesn't seem like there's a ton of excitement necessarily about the switch to the GT3 machinery, and I think it doesn't take long to look at some of the GT3 only championships that have taken place around the world and see how incredible that the racing is in the GT3 with GT3 spec cars. And I think, sure, it's not going to be exactly the same as GTE was, but I think it's going to be a new era that we're going to see, large, healthy grids of the GT cars again. And I think it's going to be a great transition from a great era that we had with GTE at the end of the day.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's just sort of where sports car racing lies right now. The manufacturer interest shifted from GTE over to prototype racing. Sort of the way the sports car racing pendulum goes. I'm sure it'll shift back at some point in the next 10 years or so. But the writing was on the wall, as you said earlier. Okay, this is a formula that's been on the way out since probably 2020, 2021 certainly. And as much as I don't want to wave goodbye to it, I'm excited to see what we get with GT3 next year. We're going to get more manufacturers than we had on the grid this year. Just from a car standpoint, I always love seeing more manufacturers on the grid. So excited to see that. The car support, unfortunately, was just the real killer. Porsche really wasn't developing their RSR anymore. Ferrari's still racing the 488 in GTE, or I guess not anymore, despite the fact that the 488 has been replaced as a road car with the 296. We already have the 296 GT3 racing this year in IMSA and around the world as well. And Aston Martin as well. They're already developing a new GT3 car for next year as well. Is it next year or is it the following year? Evo for next year?
Next year, I think.
Okay.
It's going to be for next year, yep.
So I think GT3 is the place to be right now. And it was the right step, I think, for the FIA WEC to take. Sort of following in the footsteps of IMSA a few seasons after. I know when IMSA announced that they were getting rid of GTE, it was a bit more of a surprise, but I think if you look back at it, it sort of paid off for IMSA, and I think we're going to see a similar thing for the WEC next year. But that's it. It's the off season now, and we'll be back in 2 weeks, hopefully, to do another episode. We'll see what news we get coming out of that one, out of those next 2 weeks. And
I'm sure nothing will happen.
No, probably not. Like you said, we're going to have some IMSA driver announcements, and I'm sure the WEC entry list is bound to be, well, I know the application for entries closes some point this month. I forgot the exact date, but I know it's soon. So,
yeah, I think it might be like a week and a half or so. Week and a half, 2 weeks.
We got plenty to discuss in the off season, and we got some fun things as well that we're going to have lined up for those sort of dead weeks. So stick around if you enjoyed this podcast, and hope to see you all not next week, 2 weeks for the next episode. Thank you all so much for tuning in. Take care.